A healthier, happier life begins here. Welcome to Mercy Moments, a podcast by Mercy Health in association with True Chat.
Welcome. I'm your guest host, Justin T. Weller from the State of Us podcast. Confirmed and probable causes of vaping-associated lung illness have risen to 1,080 across 48 states and 1 U.S. territory, according to the latest numbers from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. There have been 19 reported deaths. The jump of 275 cases in 1 week is a combination of new illnesses being reported and retrospective cases, with no sign that the cases have peaked, federal officials say. That's according to the Wall Street Journal. Today, we're going to be looking at youth vaping and whether or not it really is as serious a problem as it's being made out to be. We're very fortunate to be joined today by Dr. Soumya Neravetla, who is a cardiothoracic surgeon practicing in Ohio. After graduating as valedictorian from Springfield North High School, she attended Northeast Ohio Medical University. She launched and served as director of the Structural Heart Program and Robotic Thoracic Surgery in Savannah, Georgia, prior to her return to Ohio. At Springfield Regional Medical Center, she has spearheaded the lung cancer screening program and the expansion of minimally invasive cardiovascular surgery, including the launch of TAVR. In spite of her busy work schedule, she collaborates with her father outside the OR in his mission to spread awareness about prevention of cardiovascular disease and lung cancer awareness. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Today, we're also joined by Lance Jackson, Senior Resident Historian at True Chat and personality from the State of Us podcast. Lance, it's good to have you here.
We had a great discussion off air, so hopefully we can transform it here.
So according to a survey conducted by the Food and Drug Administration, there was a 78% increase in e-cigarette use by high school students and a 48% increase in use by middle school students. Why is this significant?
Lung cancer is the number one killer in the world and the United States and in men and women. And we had finally started to make a dent in it, and we're starting to see those rates decline. But now, with the increased use of e-cigarettes, I'm very concerned that those rates are going to go back up, and we're going to have a backward slide in all of that progress. In addition, e-cigarettes or vaping is really a gateway. And what we have found is that a lot of people who start with e-cigarettes then continue on to smoke regular cigarettes or try gateway other drugs. And in fact, 1/3 of high school students who are using e-cigarettes are actually using it for other substances such as marijuana. And that's obviously a very huge and concerning trend.
One thing that Lance and I talked about a few months back that we saw as concerning is there really has been a fair amount of headway made, at least up until recently, with the reduction in cigarette use amongst youth. But now you see an increase in overall tobacco use as a result of vaping because of some of the misinformation out there about this supposedly being safe. And that's kind of what we want to look at next. We mentioned the sharp increase in e-cigarette use amongst teens. And Lance, you've got...
well, there was a National Youth Tobacco Survey in 2018 done, and it shows that exactly what the doctor said is what's happening, that in 2017, tobacco use for high school students had dropped to under 20% of all students, and now is pushing 27+%. So it actually, in 1 year, and that, you know, with vaping probably being any use, but that was with all tobacco. In middle school, was up from about 6% to 7.2%, but still an increase. And you're talking about, middle school students, doggone it, that's 12 and 13-year-olds. I know it goes a little bit further up, but still with 12-year-olds, and any kind of increase is not good. And just coming from the education background, as a teacher background, the last 35 years we've spent just harping how it's not healthful, it's not good for you, and it seemed to have been going down. To see an increase now is just, among young people, it's scary.
Tragic.
So one of the other things that this survey points out too is not just the increase, but the increase in frequency and the availability of various flavors, which the FDA actually cites in this survey. Their hypothesis is that the availability of flavors and the ease of access has been one of the leading contributors along with misinformation about vaping, to one of the reasons why we see not only a higher percentage, a little over 1 in 5 high school students. I mean, you let that sink in for a second, which is very substantial. And then on top of that, more used e-cigarettes 20 or more days in the past month. That's 28%. So of the people using it, you've got a relatively high percent that are using it very frequently. I mean, we're not talking about occasional use. We're talking about regular use. And then you're also looking at a 68% margin of the people who use e-cigarettes are using more flavored e-cigarettes. So that, I think, is probably where they draw the hypothesis on, but I'm wondering if you want to expand on that at all, Dr. Neravetla.
Absolutely. So you alluded to some great valid points. The current rate of use of e-cigarettes right now is much higher than we saw in tobacco use back in the day, even 5-10 years ago. So that's concerning in and of itself. But as to the why, it's a multifaceted problem. Number one is marketing. Just like with regular cigarettes, there's always a marketing component that draws them in to even try it. And the introduction of Juul in particular was definitely a component of that. We definitely saw sharp increases in the use once Juul was released. The flavors is a huge part of it because the flavors make it more palatable for people to try it, but it also makes it more palatable for them to keep on doing it, just like you said with the frequency issue. And then again, it also makes it much more difficult for people to quit. Flavors alone have been associated with an increased frequency, as you alluded, but also a decreased rate of being able to quit. And that's regardless of having nicotine. Then when you add nicotine to the mix, which is very common in most of these e-cigarette combinations, that is a very addictive substance, and it makes it much harder for the teens to quit. So you add those multifaceted problems to the mix, and it becomes a huge issue for our youth.
So one of the big and popular options right now is Juul, which is no secret because they've of course been making a lot of the headlines. Just because we always want to make sure everybody's on the same page, and with so much misinformation out there, we've actually got an infographic here as well that I mentioned is linked from the CDC. And Lance is going to share with us a little bit.
Just from this center, just reiterates what the doctor is saying, is that the Center for Disease Control says that talks about the different flavors, cool cucumber, fruit medley, mango. But what you were alluding to there at the end, that a Juul pod contains as much nicotine as a pack of 20 regular cigarettes. And I don't think anybody realizes, because growing up, being older, but growing up, it was the nicotine, the drug, the addiction. And it's like, yeah, okay, I'm going to stay away from that because that's not good. It's not good to get addicted to anything. But here we go. It's like, oh, well, we're going to market as it'll help you, it's a cool way to smoke and it'll help you maybe quit smoking. And then daggone it, it's got as much nicotine as 20 cigarettes, and that's the addictive part or the main addictive drug within the tobacco cigarettes. So
absolutely.
The Juul is just unreal. And what scares me as a former teacher is when you look at the picture, and I don't know if Justin's going to get these up on the website for the show, but when you look at the pictures, they've marketed them as look like USB flash drives. So as a teacher, I'm sitting there thinking, well, everything's on a computer now. Everybody has their laptop, and so they pull this flash drive out of their pocket and look to put it in. And I'm going to work with another student over here, or I'm working on the other side of the room, and then they're going to go and can puff on it. And it's going to make it really hard to detect. I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but I wonder too, that just scares me to death. The high levels of nicotine. And then not only some of these are looking cool, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like they marketed being old, they marketed cigarettes that way, be the cool person, the woman with the long and the cigarette holder and, and all that kind of stuff. The marketing's not new, but it looks cool for the young people. And then it looks like devices that they carry around in their pocket to use with their technology.
Absolutely. That's definitely been shown in some surveys that students have admitted to using them in classrooms, which I don't recall that ever being an issue with regular cigarettes because you couldn't get away with that.
You at least had to go to the bathroom.
Exactly.
Right?
So one of the other things that it mentions too on the CDC graphic, which yes, Lance will be sure to have on the website for people, is because the timeline thing, I guess part of what people may not understand or be questioning is, well, why all of a sudden? Like what's the, aside from the available flavors and so forth, and this isn't it isn't to pin it all on Juul, because that's not what we're here to do today. But it is important to note that Juul became available for sale in the United States in 2015. And as of December of 2017, 2 years ago, Juul is the top selling e-cigarette brand in the United States. So, in such a short amount of time, they went from not even existing to existing and being a massive player in the space. And it's interesting that it coincides with this major rise in the use of these products. So we're going to continue this conversation. We've been talking with Dr. Soumya Neravetla and, of course, the regular Lance Jackson, senior historian here on The State of Us, and your friendly redneck liberal. We're going to be looking at next exactly from the medical perspective, what's so harmful about vaping. We've talked about it, alluded to it a little bit, but we want to get into the particulars of that. One thing that we want to look at is, as we've definitely seen a popularity with e-cigarette products, I know that one of the commonly cited reasons for vaping is that it's quote unquote safer than smoking. From a medical perspective, what's the reality on this front?
I want to be very clear and unequivocal in stating that vaping and e-cigarettes use is not safe. And one way to look at it is, would anyone compare cyanide and strychnine or asbestos? They're all poisons. And trying to say that one is more safe than the other is just as ludicrous as trying to say e-cigarettes is safer than smoking regular cigarettes. To that end, there have been multiple organizations that have cautioned the public about this for years. The American Lung Association has strongly cautioned the public against the use of e-cigarettes. The FDA has clearly stated that no e-cigarette is safe and effective in helping smokers quit and advises against it. And even the CDC recommends restraining use after the recent outbreak.
So one of the things that I think would be good just for us to understand is what about it is dangerous. We just talked, Lance brought up before the nicotine component, obviously highly addictive, but what about it is dangerous from a biological perspective?
Great question. So as the name would allude that vaping is inhaling vapors, that's actually not true. Vaping and e-cigarettes are actually aerosolized toxins. And so you are inhaling hot fumes of toxins. And the lungs aren't designed to be inhaling hot fumes of anything, frankly, and that alone is bad. But then when you add the toxins into those fumes, that is a catastrophe on a different level. And these e-cigarettes, depending on the mixture, we don't even know how many toxins are in some of these substances. And so the more components and the more flavors and the more things that are added to some of these e-cigarettes, the more toxins that are in them. And some of these small particles can actually get lodged in the tiny airways and cause problems. So there's many ways why these e-cigarettes are causing long-term damage to the lungs.
So I've heard people, layman's compare it to, well, it's kind of like the steam during a hot shower. And it sounds like from what you're describing, we're not even in the same ballpark, right?
No.
We're not talking about just water vapor here.
Definitely not.
Because there's a number of components and it's a highly concentrated mix that's being turned into, as I think you described. Lance, you probably wouldn't go home, right? Spray some air, just spray and inhale some air freshener into your body.
I'm thinking of aerosols.
Right.
And as we were growing up, kids inhaling different things, like that. It's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense at all. We learned 40 years ago that this kind of stuff was bad. So how did it... I don't know. My question is not so much medical as it is, how did this get on the market in the first place? But that's not really what we're trying to do with the show today. But about the nicotine, there's something from the CDC here that says it harms brain development until the age of, which continues to about the age of 25. So what are some of the things that, can you extrapolate on that a little bit and let us tell our listeners, what are some of the damages that the nicotine does to a young
Absolutely. You
brain?
alluded to the most concerning one, is that nicotine can still affect developing brains. And while kids are in high school or in middle school, their brains are still developing. And it's hard to know exactly how much impact that's going to have, but it certainly does have a significant impact on developing brains. And that is something that I shudder to think about the impact of with the rise in the use.
And even if they've started and they stop, we don't know how far or how much damage can be done, right? So,
absolutely.
But obviously, the sooner you stop, the less damage would be done. So strong encouragement, obviously, to quit. Correct. If you are currently.
Absolutely. The sooner you quit, the better. But the best thing is to never start at all.
So, Dr. Neravetla, have you dealt with any patients that have either suffered from a vaping-related illness or issue, or are you aware of colleagues that are dealing with this? And what's that conversation like?
Fortunately, to my knowledge, none of my colleagues or myself have seen the devastating recent acute lung injury issues that we were hearing about from the CDC. And that's good news locally. However, we still see the impact of long-term vaping use locally. One of the more common problems that we see is lung collapse. As we've alluded to earlier in the program, vaping involves a much stronger inhalation than regular cigarette smoking, and that increased pressure or force that's used to inhale when vaping is actually associated with some increased incidence of lung collapse. And so we've seen some of those cases locally. The other thing is my lung physician colleagues have definitely already started seeing some increased incidences of chronic lung disease associated with vaping. So analogous to what we saw with emphysema and tobacco and smoking use, we're already seeing some of that with vaping.
It's interesting because, I remember, it's been a little while since I was in high school now, but I remember it kind of starting to come about. I remember having, I wouldn't necessarily say friends per se, but, some classmates who had started this. You've been in the schools more recently though, Lance. What are you seeing on that front as far as, is this something that teachers are aware of, that they're seeing as a problem, or that educators are seeing as a problem?
Well, I think so. It's, if you're there, especially in high school, you stay up with the trends, because if you're doing your job, that's what the students are. And, you want to know what they're doing, but it's tough because it's catching everybody off guard because of the way it was marketed. It was going to be something that was better, obviously for youth. You still can't do it. That's what you always told the kids. They're like, well, but this is legal. Well, yeah, when you're 18, but you're not 18. So, and you're in school and we have a different set of rules. And so for you, it's not legal, but they always want to argue the legality of it. But nobody was really talking about the dangers. And that's why when this all came out, it really caught my attention, because I'm concerned, because I think people are out there using these things without understanding what the ramifications are. And that's, as an educator, that's the scary part, right? We need to educate people on what they're doing and what they're doing to themselves. And it's too bad that it's taken people getting sick and even dying for people to understand that this is not a good thing.
No,
but it's out there. You can see it. You see it when they're walking home from school and when they're hanging out at the local eateries and that kind of stuff. You see that young people are using this. So it's we're not in a small town. We're not immune from the problem. So you have to educate them and let them know that this is not good for you.
It seems like a lot of the stuff that we talk about comes back to that, and we're going to talk about some of the solutions here in a second. But I think that may be one of the biggest problems, is just that people really don't have the reliable information. It's just now starting to really be pushed out there, because I think it is that so many people do still believe, but also did believe, that this is really, that it was safe, that it's not something that's going to cause long-term problems for you, or really any problem at all.
And when you deal with young people, there's that piece of invincibility that you always have to break through. That's why, the brain's not fully developed until 25 anyway. But they think that nothing's going to happen to them. Well, okay, right. This could happen to somebody else, but it doesn't happen to me because I'm young, I'm strong, I'm viral. I'm going to, I can jump off of second story buildings into a little wading pool because that would be cool and fun. And, they just do stupid things. We know that because their brains aren't developed yet. So here they are, they've been fed, lies basically that these aren't as bad. So you can do this and you can be cool and you can be an adult, and here, it'll taste good as well. And at the whole time, it's damaging them maybe for life.
Absolutely.
Right? It's with what you're talking about, it's the damage is going to keep recurring all through their life.
And in fact, that's part of the reason why the state of Ohio actually recently passed the Tobacco 21 bill. And so with the Tobacco 21, that includes all cigarettes and e-cigarettes, so any form. So vaping is not immune to that, which is a great step in the right direction, because the use of cigarettes and e-cigarettes in this younger population is a significant problem for the rest of their lives.
So, Lance, we're talking about this today, as we do with many different problems. And this is one I think that's getting, unlike a lot of what we cover, it is getting mainstream news attention. I'm not sure how concise and easy to understand and make sense of and discuss actionable items all of that is, but that's part of what we're trying to do here, right? So tell us a little bit, what's True Chat's
our mission statement is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
You think we're getting that done?
I do, and I'm so glad that we've got help here today.
Yes.
Because it's very enlightening.
There are times where it's not that Lance and I talking about this on our own wouldn't be valuable, but it is helpful to have somebody who is an expert and who works around this environment all the time and is in that medical community. So we definitely appreciate you being here. Keep in mind, this is nearly 1 in 5 high school students that are making use of e-cigarettes. We've established how dangerous they truly are, and from a medical perspective, what the issues surrounding them are. So from the medical community's perspective, what's being done to combat this issue?
I think with any issue, it's always a multi-pronged approach. And the first approach, as physicians, of course, is our patients. And so our number one responsibility and the most common thing we do is obviously educate our patients. And we continue to do that day in and day out on a very regular basis. The second thing that I personally do and many of the physicians in the community do is educate our community, and doing things like this podcast is just one example. But we also do other talks in the community. And in fact, we're arranging and helping coordinate some education at the schools with the assemblies and promoting awareness about not just e-cigarettes, but all tobacco products. Next, obviously, is as a community being keeping in connection with each other. And that's how the CDC has been able to make some headway with the recent cases of acute lung injury. And so it's our obligation to continue to report any cases that we think are unusual to the CDC. And we as a medical community continue to do that so that we can make some progress in the big picture and kind of get to the source of some of these more recent issues. And then finally is advocating for policy change. And that's a bigger, more long-term issue. And we as physicians have a role in that environment as well. And physicians had a big role in the recent change of the Tobacco 21. The AHA was a big advocate for changing those rules. And with the Tobacco 21 rule and the recent law, there were some other things that got passed, including an increased taxation on tobacco in the form of regular cigarettes. But in addition, we finally have an e-cigarette tax, which is new. And personally, I'm actually meeting with some policymakers next month to see where we can actually expand this even further.
So one of the things, Lance and I have talked about this at length before. We've debated a lot, not just on this issue, but generally speaking, age limits, and is that really, quote unquote, the answer? I think as you identified, and that's part of what I was glad to hear you say, is it is a multi-pronged approach, right? What I fear with age limits is that for a lot of people, and sometimes lawmakers, use it as a convenient way to go back to their constituents and say, well, look, we fixed it. We did what needed to be done, and now everything's good. And of course, that's not the case. I mean, it may be a very important step in the right direction, but it is not by any means the end of the road, because it's not like once you become an adult, we don't care about your health either. Obviously, we have a reason to specifically care about kids and making sure that they're not making decisions that are harmful for the rest of their life. But at the same time, we care about adults too. So I think, I don't know, Lance, what do you think about the age increase here? What's your read on this?
It's like we've always talked about it. The main thing is education, because it's tough when you talk about ages, because people are going to choose to do, and I get my libertarian going, and it's like, well, I have the choice to do this. And if I decide to harm myself, then, we talked about the societal values and everything else, but I liked what we're talking about as far as education, because that's the key. People need to know. I think many people started doing this because they didn't think it was as harmful. It was sold to them as something that was a healthier version of something that they didn't want to do or they saw as being damaging to them. So I can still have enjoyment and not hurt myself as much. And so I think it's important to get the health aspect out there and say, no, in many ways, it's not that you're hurting yourself less, you're actually hurting yourself more by doing this. And so therefore it was not a wise decision to go to this. Because I think that's the way it was sold. And then what's really scary with the young people is the way it was marketed to me. And again, it's putting the cart before the horse and kind of arguing after the fact that why in the world were they allowed to market it as something, cool and technologically advanced with flavors that look like technology devices. Those are all really where the government dropped the ball to allow this. And like it points out in a couple of the articles we're reading, a lot of this has been unregulated, for the first 4 years. I mean, it's an unregulated market, and it's like, you don't know what you're getting. So you go into these stores, or you go in, somebody just pops up a little shop somewhere on the corner. You don't know what you're buying. We've talked about that when we talk about cannabis sales and everything else, that is it better for the government to get involved in that? At least what you're getting, with the Food and Drug Administration. When I pick up a can of green beans, 150 years ago, you didn't know what was in that can of green beans.
Might not be all green beans.
Right. President Roosevelt at the turn of the century had to come in and, say, we're going to make a federal law saying you have to write all the ingredients that go in there, because before you could put anything you wanted in anything and sell it and it was fine. So
the horror stories you hear about those
how did we get to this
factories?
Right. Yeah. How did we get to this point where somebody can come up with something new like this that's very dangerous and just say, oh, look at all the cool things it'll do.
Right. So I think it's
without being held responsible.
Yeah. It's not that Lance and I don't think want to sound
like I kind of went off your age thing, but it's
totally poo-pooing that. But there's other things the government could do that would be potentially significantly more useful. And from a historical perspective, right? You look at the history of cigarette marketing and where it started and where it ended. And I say ended because, the prevalence of cigarette marketing has dropped drastically, especially when you look at industry figures on how much is being spent today versus what was spent. And of course, the mandatory Surgeon General warnings that accompany everything. All of that is stuff that no single item probably is the answer.
Well, and it took time.
Right. And it took.
I'm old enough. I don't know if you guys, you both are, but I remember cigarettes being advertised on television. I saw commercials. I watched commercials as a young person growing up,
Lots of celebrities.
And now you wouldn't, oh my gosh, that would be horrible. And people think, well, how could you ever do that? But now you have the e-cigarettes, they're being advertised on television. Nothing's new. How do we let it happen? But that doesn't solve the problem. So
yeah,
go ahead.
But to be frank, we hadn't really solved the problem with tobacco yet either. We were making some progress, but it was still a very big problem. And every single day I counsel patients about the harms of smoking cigarettes and quitting smoking. Every single day, I would say almost 2/3 of my office is spent counseling patients about quitting smoking.
So what were they sharing with you about why they did it?
A lot of them are addicted to nicotine, and they understand that it's hard, that it's not good for them, but they just struggle to quit.
Had they started young, or had they picked it up and just didn't matter when they started, they were addicted?
Definitely a lot of them have started young. And I think that's part of the reason for the Tobacco 21 push, is that we do have some data to show that the younger you start, the harder it is to quit.
Sure.
And so people who start smoking people who started smoking between the age of 18 and 21 were actually less likely to quit. And so pushing that up to 21 could give us some improved data long-term in terms of our cessation rates. So even though e-cigarettes is a bad problem. Tobacco is also still a bad problem, and we need to work on all of it.
Is it an issue too because it's something that damages your body, but you don't see it immediately? I understand you understand what I'm saying. I mean, maybe have some shortness of breath or whatever, but when I'm in my 20s, I'm still out running.
Well, like
I can still
jump
go
off the building into a little splash pool. You break your leg, and but I probably shouldn't do that again. And this is more of a.
But it doesn't stop me from doing anything that I want to do. And then I get into my 30s and 40s, or at least my 50s, where I am now. And then that long-term use, it's shortness of breath, it's the emphysema, it's the COPD, lung cancer. Is it because we don't feel the immediate? You think that.
And not to mention all the cardiovascular issues as well. And all the cancer risks, almost all the cancers are at increased risk when you smoke. I think that's particularly a problem with e-cigarettes because at least when you first try to smoke, I don't know this from personal experience, but I can speak to other people who have described it to me, is that it's not a pleasant experience. Your first attempt is gross and nasty and it makes you cough. And I still don't understand why a lot of people even try.
Why go back?
Why go back? But with e-cigarettes, it's not like that at all. The first experience is often a pleasant experience. And so there's nothing deterring people from going back.
So Lance, let's share a little bit. We've got, again, referencing this time, the infographic from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the CDC. A couple suggestions that they've outlined very clearly what parents and educators can do. So,
well, the biggest thing that they talk about is what I've been mentioning, and probably because I got it from them, but it's just understand the shapes and types of e-cigarettes that are out there and the risks that are there. Talk to your children about it. We've talked about that before. Have that open dialogue. Hopefully you already have that. And this is just another piece of information that you can share with your children. And then I think it's the biggest one. You set a positive example by being tobacco free yourself. So you're not being hypocritical, especially with teenagers. That's a big deal, having raised them. Plus it makes it easier for kids not to start if they're not around it. It doesn't make it as easy to get, to obtain. As educators, again, same thing. Learn about the different shapes and types of e-cigarettes. As we mentioned earlier, have tobacco prevention programs, that in the schools, and talk about it, and implement and enforce those policies. And so it's all common sense. I mean, maybe I'm too old, but this is like all common sense things. But the biggest thing now, at least, and here's where, I don't like social media, but maybe here's where social media has been helpful in that the word has gotten out very quickly, which I'm not so sure it would have gotten out this quickly otherwise. So hopefully we're out there stopping some people before they ever start, and then definitely letting them know, hey, this isn't good for you, and it's easier to stop if you try to stop now than if you continue for another 3 to 5 years and then try to stop.
Right. Well, and
I mean, that's what,
to your point, Dr. Neravetla pointed out, we certainly by no means have won the battle against tobacco use, but you think about when cigarette use started to become popular and how long it took, and is still taking to fight that. And it's not that before 2015, this wasn't a problem, but obviously in the past couple of years, it's become more of a problem. We're talking about, 4 years, and now we're having this very serious conversation about it. So 4 years is too long, yes. And no, we haven't done enough fast enough, but it is encouraging that it's moving much faster, I think, than we did in the past with similar type products. And part of that's, you've been through it, right? I mean, the medical community went through it. The medical community figured it out. Educators, schools, parents, they all figured it out before. And we know, hey, we got to be on this right away. Because if you wait, it gets harder. I mean, every day that
we already have a detailed
every year
roadmap.
That it increases and the more students using it, the harder it is to combat it.
We have a detailed roadmap already that we can follow, and getting started earlier hopefully can be more effective.
Yep. Dr. Neravetla, thank you so much for taking time to be on. I appreciate the insight.
It's been a pleasure.
Yes.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
For Mercy Moments on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Soumya Neravetla.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.